Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia built three intelligence giants to protect the state: the SVR to watch the world, the GRU to shape the battlefield, and the FSB to police the homeland. But these are not merely agencies, they are rival empires. Each has its own culture, loyalties and secret wars. Their officers do not simply collect information, they compete for influence. But now a quieter transformation is underway. Russia is reshaping its spy agencies from the inside, purging all networks, suppressing regional identities and enforcing a new rule: Russian blood first. The SVR, the GRU and the FSB, they still operate in the shadows, but their shadows are shrinking. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
This is a trial in Germany against three so-called disposable Russian agents. Over the last few years, there have been several similar cases across Europe, with multiple individuals being recruited by Russian intelligence services to carry out acts of espionage or even sabotage, all while none of those involved are official Russian agents. European nations are warning that Russia has been rapidly intensifying its spying operations up to almost unprecedented levels. The goal, according to European leaders, is clear.
Putin has long been testing boundaries. He sabotages, he spies, he kills, he tries to create insecurity. Russia wants to destabilize our societies.
The Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, has become particularly cunning in how it operates. Rather than relying on Russian-trained intelligence operatives, it has been recruiting people who will not immediately strike other countries' intelligence services as spies. But that's not all. Russian espionage has also become a hallmark of Moscow's diplomatic service. Since 2022, European countries have expelled over 750 Russian diplomats accused of espionage.
Our formal Czech proposal to limit the movement of Russian diplomatic staff through the Schengen area, I would like to reiterate that it's not only about the fact that this network serves to the operation of Russian secret services.
The reach of Russian services is long and was dangerous prior to the war, exemplified by the case of Sergei Skripal's poisoning in 2018. To prevent these kinds of incidents from taking place in the present, as the Russian espionage machine fires on all cylinders, will require extreme vigilance from Western countries.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Russia's intelligence service agencies are some of the most developed in the world. The leading ones are known under dangerous-sounding three-letter acronyms. And while they may immediately come across as having similar roles, there are key differences between them.
The main Russian intelligence agencies are commonly known under their acronyms, the FSB, the SVR, and the GRU. As is customary in the Russian government, two of these agencies, the FSB and the SVR, report directly to the Russian president. The GRU, as the military main intelligence directorate, reports to the Minister of Defense, and therefore also indirectly to President Vladimir Putin. The FSB is the Russian Federal Security Service, responsible for counterintelligence operations, state security, and sometimes intelligence gathering in the Commonwealth of Independent States. Although all of Russia's intelligence agencies are successors to the infamous Soviet KGB, the FSB is often regarded as the true heir. The SVR is the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service and is focused on collecting information outside of the aforementioned Commonwealth. It is a relatively small agency and often works in tandem with the much larger and influential GRU. The GRU is perhaps the most threatening to foreign countries, as it is the primary agency of the Russian military and has been held directly responsible for carrying out sabotage operations outside of Russian borders, often through recruited agents.
And now it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Russia's intelligence services were never meant to be homogeneous. In fact, their strength historically came from their diversity, not just of skills, but of backgrounds, languages and instincts. Today, however, Vladimir Putin is reversing decades of experience. Non-Russian officers are being quietly pushed out of the FSB, and high-ranking posts are increasingly reserved for ethnic Russians alone. Let's be clear, the demographic trend in Russia makes this move even more puzzling. According to the 2021 census, only about 72% of Russia's population is ethnically Russian. 6 million fewer than just a decade ago. Minority populations have been rising, while ethnic Russians are declining. Yet Moscow has stopped releasing demographic updates because even numbers can become politically dangerous. Instead of adapting, the Kremlin is doubling down. It is cleansing its security services of the very people who, historically, once made them so effective. This wasn't always the case. Even when Stalin feared their influence and began suppressing their networks, his successors retained some pragmatism. The Kremlin may have feared ethnic networks, but it still understood this. Local knowledge matters. If you want to control the periphery, you need the periphery inside the system. That logic has disappeared now under Putin. Looking through the list of department heads, almost no Tatars, Chechens, or representatives from other major ethnic groups. Even Ukrainians have vanished completely, especially following the disastrous intelligence failures leading up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Those who remained have been systematically replaced by ethnic Russians. And the consequences are already visible, not in what the FSB reports, but in what it misses out. When your intelligence services exclude people who deeply understand regional cultures, languages, and grievances, your blind spots multiply. Your ability to detect early warning signs like local unrest, political tension, religious radicalization shrinks, begins to disappear, right? A security service that thinks loyalty means sameness is slowly becoming deaf to diversity. And that is how empires actually fracture over the time. But here lies the paradox. Putin fears that regions like Tatarstan or Chechnya may one day seek autonomy, just like former Soviet republics once did. And so, he excludes non-Russians from leadership, thinking it will secure control. Yet by doing so, he weakens the very mechanism meant to detect regional threats in the first place. You can't monitor local tensions if the people best equipped to understand them never make it to the command post. Russia believes its spy services must be purified to stay loyal. History suggests that diversity made them powerful. In cleansing its agencies, the Kremlin may not be eliminating threats, but creating them instead. Intelligence is foresight, and foresight never speaks in one voice. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is our guest today, Rasmus Nielsen, lecturer of Slavic and East European Studies at University College London. Hello and welcome once again to Eastern Express.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So let's begin with an open question. Many people are talking about the possibility of conflict in Europe in the next couple of years. Do you think the more likely option is a kinetic conflict of any kind, or something more along the lines of a new Cold War, where espionage would be the main tool in the arsenal of both sides, with agents moving in the shadows and trying to undermine the other side's capabilities?
Yes, I mean, to answer in short, the second option you present there is the more likely scenario. The thing to understand, of course, and you've laid it out well in what you said now, that there is conflict either way. I mean, we are in a conflict with Russia as things stand. But yeah, the second situation, what is colloquially known as hybrid warfare, is or part of hybrid warfare is much more likely, and espionage will be definitely part of that, as will be various subversive missions like we've seen recently in recent days in Poland, for instance, with the railways.
So exploring, and exploiting this murky ambiguity between war and peace, likely to be operatives of many different types. Let's begin first by focusing on the more professional side. So we have the GRU, the FSB and the SVR. Can you perhaps say which of these is likely to be most active in our part of the world, meaning Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, I mean, theoretically, the FSB's main focus should be on domestic politics, and therefore the FSB should be the least active of the three. Having said that, though, I say the FSB, as well as the SVR and the GU, are all likely to have some activity abroad. SVR or GRU will be more active in Central Eastern Europe and in Europe overall, but it can be quite difficult sometimes to discern who's involved in what. I think the thing perhaps to underline to begin with the different spy agencies in Russia is that within each spy agency, so within, say, the SVR, you've got a number of different divisions, a number of different groups who are all fighting for cash from the Russian state coffers. And that means these different divisions will set off on different missions at different times. So sometimes it can be quite difficult not only to figure out whether the SVR, say, or the GRU, or even the FSB is in play, but it can be difficult to figure out which part or which parts, plural, of a given service is in play.
So now, assuming that we're going to be facing this sort of intelligence warfare on a large scale, do you think we're ready for this eventuality? I mean, obviously, our mindset here in Europe, especially Western Europe, has changed. And we are keeping tabs on what Russia is doing. But do you think that stuff like sabotage, like kinetic action, cyber warfare, this has already been happening? But what if Russia decides to actually turn it up to 11, increase the scale of these operations?
Yeah, I will even say I'm slightly surprised that this hasn't been turned up further already. I did really like the fact that you now started talking about the mentality, our thinking, our understanding of these operations, because I think this is absolutely crucial. Can we ever protect ourselves completely from, let's say, underhand or subversive or sabotage attacks? No, we can't. That's sort of in the nature of the beast. But what we can do is, apart from building up our practical capability to resist it, we can also build up our mental ability to resist it. That is, we can do, as populations and as governments across Europe and North America, we can try to prepare ourselves mentally for the fact that we are in this for the long haul. That these things, like for instance, again, what happened with the Polish railways in recent days, that this will happen from time to time. I'm sort of thinking, without necessarily comparing otherwise, but I'm sort of thinking about when terrorism became a big sort of narrative in the West after 9/11, and again in the last, 15 years or so, where gradually you saw public discourse getting to an understanding of the fact that we can do a lot to prepare ourselves and to minimize the risk from these attacks, but we can't completely remove the risk. And I think that's important to take in, because if we get into that fallacy of thinking we can completely remove the risk, we can completely stop all Russian, say, attacks on Western Europe, then every time an attack does get through, we will get more demoralized, and that doesn't help anybody. So we must try to go out and keep our intelligence operations up, both inside, say, the European Union, but outside as well. And we must keep trying to put diplomatic and economic pressure on Russia to make it clear that consistent conflict with the West is not in Russian interest.
Also, a possibly useful argument here is that, following the increased emphasis on fighting terrorism, we never had another 9/11, right? We've managed to avoid this, even though we were examining scenarios up to and including the use of fissile materials or dirty bombs. I mean, that was very much at the but making the headlines at that one point, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right, and it's always slightly difficult to be happy about a negative, if you see what I mean, something that didn't happen. But this is definitely something we should praise, that that we didn't have any attack using nuclear materials. I will say though that after 9/11 we had the attacks in Spain in 2004, we had Bataclan in Paris, and so on. So there were significant attacks, and of course until this day, non-state terrorism, say from Islamist groups, does remain a serious threat, absolutely. But my point more was that we should not get into this binary thinking of thinking that there is a specific problem, and if we just do something, like for instance attack somewhere, or like for instance in the case of Russia, if we just give in to Russia and say, okay, we're not going to push you too much anymore, then things will be fine, or when Putin dies everything will change. That's not the scenario we are in. Instead, we have to, for the long term, understand that we have a way of living in the vast majority of Europe, which is apparently provocative to other people, say, for instance, the Russian regime. And we have a way of living that needs to be protected, including against subversive attacks. That will be the case next year, in 5 years, in 10 years, and so on. And we've got to get ready for that.
Let's talk about briefly, about deterrence. Does a deterrence narrative also work when we consider this possibility of this long protracted war of spies? We do actually follow this narrative in terms of conventional capabilities, gathering them up and thinking, okay, if Russia sees that, they're not going to strike first. Now, should we also have a counter-strike ability when it comes to hybrid warfare? Because many people say, okay, we're talking about the FSB, we're talking about the GRU, we consider them to be powerful players in this field. Does Russia have any sort of Western agency that it fears in equal measure as we do fear the Russian agencies? Should we perhaps have the capability of sending our agents in and perhaps not conducting a kinetic strike, but at least leaving a trace, like an unexploded munition, which would give them a signal, okay, we could have done that, we're here, we're operating in your backyard, so it's not just you who can actually use this sort of, this sort of tactic to intimidate us or to influence our decisions. Would it go too far beyond the principles that the West was built upon? Or is it something that, a capability that we should rebuild and let Russians know that we have it?
So we do have the capabilities, and Russia knows that we do, and that we could build it up further. The question comes down to exactly should we try to do it? In that case, we have to define very carefully what we mean by it. I would say right now, in terms of showing what the outside world can do, I think the Ukrainians are doing quite a lot in terms of hitting the Russian energy infrastructure, which is what you can see is something that is definitely causing pain to the Russian economy and the Russian state. When Russia was just now attacking civilian targets again in western Ukraine, the Russian state was pretty much openly referring back to the Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure and saying this is in retaliation for Ukrainian attacks. So definitely that sort of pain is being caused, and I can see justification of why the Ukrainians are doing it. If we are talking, and I accept you weren't necessarily saying that, but if we were talking about simulated or even real attacks that had a high probability of hitting Russian civilians, I would strongly advise against. To a large extent, because that goes against Western values. This is simply not what we should be standing in for. But also because if we are to try and convince ordinary Russians and ordinary people elsewhere in the world that we actually stand for a law-abiding, law-governed, and also just, if you like, a morally just, if I can be so bold, a morally just part of the world, then we cannot be seen to go in and say, place, for instance, even a fake bomb in a shopping mall or anything like that.
No, of course, I was talking more about infrastructure, military targets, that sort of thing,
Sure.
signaling that we have the capability in this regard, naturally not resorting to anything even approaching, these terrorist methods that Russia apparently is willing to use, right?
Sure, and I think, no, I accept you weren't saying that, and I think it's worth us once in a while reminding everybody and Russia that that's not what we would do. But I would even say, sometimes you can go for military targets, and it's fairly clear it will just be the military that's hit, and that can be seen as defensible. But if, say, you go for a railway line, like again Russia did now by all accounts in Poland, and has obviously done plenty of times in Ukraine, you might also hit civilian transit. It may not be what you want to do, but it is a risk. And I just think the West should be very careful in how it chooses its targets. I would say in that regard, it seems to me that overall the Ukrainians are fairly careful that what they hit is military, are military targets. And I think the Ukrainians should be commended and supported for that. As long as that remains the case, that's where we should aim. And yeah, absolutely, if the West could do something more to, say, damage the Russian economy, particularly the military side of it, that should definitely be looked at, and I'm sure is being looked at. But we've got to make that distinction really clear.
Rasmus Nilsson was our guest today here on DVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. A former Belarusian law enforcement officer has revealed how China has been enabling Belarus's munitions production for Russia. The arms industry of Belarus has been able to produce 500,000 shells annually for Moscow.
Despite Russian assertions that no third countries should become involved in the war in Ukraine, Moscow has been very eager to accept aid from its partners, be it indirectly or through direct means. China is a country who continuously appears in the context of supporting Russia. Beijing has apparently facilitated the creation of vast production lines in Belarus, used to produce hundreds of thousands of artillery shells and rockets. According to a former Belarusian law enforcement officer, China has sent over engineers to Belarus to install these production lines. This enormous amount of munitions goes only to Russia, as Moscow is Belarus's sole client in this project. This information comes as NATO officials have become increasingly concerned by China's willingness to support the Russian war machine, which they believe poses a threat to all of Europe.
One of Russia's largest oil refineries has suspended operations after it was hit by a Ukrainian drone strike. The refinery will not resume supplies until December.
Ukraine continues to carry out successful strikes against critical Russian infrastructure. The refinery in question, located in Ryazan, belongs to the Russian state-owned oil giant Rosneft, which has also recently been the target of strong US sanctions. The facility produces over 800,000 tons of aviation fuel annually, used by the Russian aerospace forces. It is currently unclear how much this refinery shutdown will affect Russian military operations, but it is presumed to hinder at least some of their activity in Ukraine. This was not the first such strike carried out by Ukrainian forces, as they have been targeting Russian oil refineries and plants to hinder Moscow's supply lines. Previous strikes have even led to gasoline shortages across the entire Russian Federation.
The Afghan refugee community in Tajikistan is currently on edge after the country's authorities deported hundreds of Afghans. Many of the individuals had held legal status in the country.
This summer alone, Tajikistan deported at least close to 1,300 Afghan citizens, most of them refugees or asylum seekers. Officially, the country's authorities say that the deportations were carried out due to the individuals allegedly breaking the law, but the Afghan community has questioned this rhetoric. They say that those who were deported had been living in Tajikistan legally and had not broken any laws. Many Afghan refugees also said that there are several unwritten rules that they must follow to stay in the authorities' good graces, such as appropriately trimming their beards. Nonetheless, despite the community being on edge, there are still voices within it that praise Tajikistan for treating them better than other countries like Pakistan or Iran.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.